Get started first. Before we start, though, I do just want to let people know next Tuesday is the branch cut. So if you have anything you're hoping to get into 125, probably speak up. Otherwise, might not make it.
Sure, I'm happy to kick things off, I guess. I wanted to bring up something that a user reported in Slack. And they had a question that was really pointed about how do you implement default deny policy in ambient when you introduce a waypoint? And what effectively happens is you have some policy, it's applied at Z tunnel. The waypoint is introduced at the Z tunnel level. You'll want to allow traffic from the waypoint to your workload. That all makes sense. But because the waypoint itself didn't pick up a default deny, you now have this little island in an otherwise default deny mesh where everything is allowed until you introduce a new policy. So that's not great. It's our new flagship data plane, and it kind of has this awkward rub with our preferred policy posture. I think naturally we kind of wanted to fit this into the Gateway API in a nice way and not just immediately fall back to like Istioisms, such as it's in Istio system, so therefore it applies. And we've considered binding a policy to the gateway class. So you would essentially say, this policy applies to the Istio waypoint class, and then that is your default policy. Okay, that seems workable, at least on the surface. Took that upstream. They don't like it. It's not recommended. They did basically admit that it was probably initially intended, but that it's out of favor, and they suggested params ref as an alternative. And so that is essentially inverting the logic in the all right. We'll give John a moment to speak here, but I'll just...
Sorry, I'm a gateway class params ref hater, so a little extreme, but I can go into why, but I don't want to interrupt you too much.
Sure. I was just going to say that essentially, for folks who weren't familiar, it's inverting the logic. We basically call out from the gateway class and say, hey, this policy applies. And I think that does have at least one nice advantage in that we could reference the... All right, we got a lot of haters. No worries. I'm not necessarily married to this solution. I just wanted to present what upstream suggested.
Yeah, sorry, that wasn't hate against you proposing. It was just about the upstream suggestion. The reasons why I don't like it, actually, in this case, it's even worse because params ref there's one, as far as I know. And so, like, what are you referencing? Like, we're probably going to add params ref to like a gateway customization, so you can add like replicas and sizing and stuff like that. So, like, now does authorization policy go into that? Like, it doesn't make sense. It would have to be like a list. But the bigger problem is that gateway class is not like something a user creates. Like, it's supposed to be that's like the implementation just kind of deploys them and they're kind of in your cluster. So I've always thought that anything that involves a user touching gateway class is just fundamentally broken. In terms of like actually modifying the gateway class, referencing it as like a parent ref or target ref or whatever, that part seems fine to me, aside from the namespace problems. But a user touching it, that's bizarre.
Yeah, I figured we would probably have to work through this so that it's like an install time thing or similar. Otherwise, yeah, we might overwrite it, and that's not great either. Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to add that, yeah, this feels like, I mean, whether the right person has the right ownership, I see John's point, and I'm just ignoring that for a second. It also, like, I don't know how, in Sidecar, I could say that this namespace has a default deny posture. And I think if I'm interpreting this right, really it would just be the cluster has a default deny posture, which still It feels like maybe it's treating some of the problem, but it's not as elegant as it used to be.
Yeah. Go ahead. Lior, I hope I'm saying your name right.
Yeah. Just to confirm, are you saying that the authorization policy would be updated to reference like the second, I guess the second suggestion proposal, the authorization policy would be updated to reference the gateway class?
It would be the opposite. The gateway class would reference the authorization policy.
This is the using parameter.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm asking on the second option, right? On the second option, was it that the authorization policy would target ref the gateway class?
Yeah, that was originally what we had brought upstream.
I see.
The Kubernetes gateway community.
Yeah. But I think John's concern like valid for both. Like, you know, gateway class, it's something installed by the implementation, so definitely not editing it, but also referencing it from the authorization policy, making the user like having to be aware of the gateway class and, you know, kind of almost managing it.
But you have to already for gateway, right? You have the gateway class name. I mean, maybe that's bad too.
Yeah.
But it's at least an existing badness.
Yeah, that's fair.
And let's not forget the permission model and the fact, you know, the whole mutual consent that we struggled in Istio and we maybe fixed it in Gateway with allow and deny and all the other stuff. So every time you have someone reference something, it's the question to ask is, can you break something at security level by targeting the wrong thing without permissions? And how do you get consent to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an issue if you're referencing the gateway class, like defining
And
who's
anything else.
allowed to. You're basically back to like magic namespace that allows this or something. It's probably more clear when you're using paramref, I think, but.
So yeah, and was that most of the feedback you got about the second option, or did you get additional feedback why not to reference the gateway class?
To be honest, this was like, I don't know, 2 months ago now, and I don't remember the exact pushback against referencing the gateway class. It's certainly, I think, not in the definitions right now. But go ahead, Costin.
Can I ask why it's a problem for Istio, for ambient in general? I mean, we have plenty of mesh configs and other ways to address this. That we don't have to do absolutely everything with gateway.
Yeah, so this is the other thing that we could consider is some solution that is outside the Gateway API, right? For the most part, waypoints follow Gateway API, so it was a natural place to start. But if we have no good solutions, we could always say, oh, you know what? We'll just say that anything that lives in Istio system that's not bound specifically applies as a default, like it does everywhere else.
We do it already. I mean, it's
Yeah.
how IstioD behaves, not nothing new. And service entry is outside of the gateway API. You know, we have our own APIs.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, so I was under the impression there are two ways you can do denying policy, default deny. So one way is I apply it on my Istio system or whatever root namespace. I think that's the scenario you're referring to. The second scenario is I do it on my namespace that I only want this namespace to have a default deny policy. I don't want other namespace yet, because this namespace maybe have a different security requirements. So I assume we're trying to have a solution that tackles both. Is that fair?
I think that would be ideal. Right now, I was focusing on the cluster scope, but neither of these solutions is really good for a namespace scope. Like we don't expect a user to create their own namespace specific gateway class. So anything that's
Right.
involving the gateway class is kind of a non-starter.
Yeah.
We got a bunch of questions. Lior, go.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, do you have like, I'm happy to, I mean, like, just like, first thing that come to my mind is that the second option is better. Obviously, I'm happy to kind of bring it back with gateway community to see, but do you have any issue, or like, was it mostly like, you know, conversations over the meetings?
I mean, if we decide to do it with an Istio API, I don't think we need to bring it back to any to gateway. I mean, it's
yeah. I mean, to this point, I think it's a little bit confusing, right? Where, I mean, obviously that's the current state right now, but I think we want to, I mean, obviously first time here, but like want to move to a state where the user does not need to remember, you know, the things I put in Istio API and then Istio system magic happens, but the things is like, you know, supported in gateway. Unfortunately, that's the reality today, but I guess it will be nicer for the users to have more and more things in one place.
I mean, maybe for common things, but some things that, I mean, Jane had a very good point that per namespace is a very, very important use case. I don't also agree that Istio system is the right solution. I mean, we kind of want in general to have, I mean, Mitch has set up hopefully to say the same thing, but, you know, graceful migrations and not breaking things in the entire cluster. So revision, that applying it to Istio D revision, not, you know, entire cluster goes down instantaneously. So there are all kind of nuances. In some cases are reasonable to have Istio specific solutions.
Mitch, I think you're up next.
Thank you. Forgot to unmute. I'll echo what Costin said and kind of focus, I think, on user experience. If I set an L4 default deny policy at any scope, cluster, namespace, service, and then I place a waypoint in front of that service, I would expect the default deny to continue. So I think there's actually kind of two API difficulties here. One is that it sounds like the user has to explicitly allow traffic to come from the waypoint to begin with. It seems like maybe that should be allowed by default.
We do have an option that you can enable for that. It's tricky to troubleshoot. And the issue would be once you add that like implicitly, you now have an allow rule, and anything that doesn't match an allow rule will get denied. So certain things that were working before suddenly stop working, and especially if you're a user, you can't even look at the ztunnel config in most instances. So you're like, why did this ephemeral thing begin to affect me? It's definitely a tricky problem. I agree with your higher level assertion that ideally it would not be for the user a tricky problem, but yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that really comes down to logic, right? We need to write an allow policy for the gateway in the scenarios where we're in a default deny posture. When we're not already in a default deny posture, we need to not write an allow policy for the gateways because that would cause us to enter into a default deny posture. But overall, the user experience that we're aiming for, I think, is that if I write default deny, it just applies. If I have a gateway, it applies. If I don't have a gateway, it applies. I can change whether or not I have a gateway and have it continue to apply. Whereas it sounds like the current experience is, we'll say, far more nuanced than
that. Yeah, nuance is a very nice way to describe that. Andrew, I think you're up next.
I was going to say something different, but now I'm going to pick up on Mitch's thing, and I'll hold my other one until after. But I definitely found that experience that, like, it's felt like it stems from how there's now essentially two authorization policies rather than one, and you have to target them separately. So if I do a default deny at L4 and then I deploy a waypoint, either my waypoint doesn't work until I've made an authorization policy for it, or once I've made an authorization policy from waypoint to the destination, now it kind of feels like I've fallen into it's worked correctly, but it would be a surprise, I think, to say I have a default deny and I've just deployed a waypoint and wired it up, and now all of a sudden everyone's allowed to talk to this service again. And it's kind of felt to me like by having L4 and L7 policies being the same object, but having to have two instances, they get pretty confusing, or I felt it confusing. Like I would expect more that it's more of an implementation detail, that I would say nobody's allowed to talk to X, and then Istio figures out whether or not they're going to come through a waypoint or they're going to come through some other means, and they block it accordingly.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just digesting that thought. Lynn, go ahead.
Okay. I think I kind of agree with Mitch was saying. Is it possible that we make an exception for denying policy, whether you apply the denying policy to your namespace or whether you apply denying policy globally, that even though the denying policy typically is a layer 4 policy, correct me if my understanding is incorrect, we still automatically apply to whichever waypoint that's in scope, whether it's a namespace waypoint or in the current namespace, or whether it's a global that applies to all the waypoints.
Sure.
That way we don't have to ask users to change the default denying policy, which is pretty nice.
Mostly
Yeah.
agree. Sorry.
Go ahead, Costin. Sorry.
No, I wanted to plus one what Lynn said, but to correct a bit. I mean, L4 and what Andre I think said earlier that it's better to have L4 and L7 kind of confusion. So maybe we can have a per namespace policies that default deny that applies to both L4 and L7. So at least you can both at the same time. And I strongly believe we need to have namespace prioritized, because the only safe migration is to do it namespace by namespace and incremental. It's super dangerous to do it at cluster levels. That's kind of my main problem with all the gateway class settings. It's a huge hammer that is guaranteed to create outages.
So one, I guess, sort of issue with this is it creates, I think, more nuance in that whether it's clear or not, we tried to draw this distinct boundary of like, if it doesn't have a parent ref or a target ref, it doesn't apply to waypoint. And now we're going to introduce this sort of nuance of, well, sometimes if we think it's a default deny, it applies. Why just default deny? I don't know. But anyways, it seems to me to muddy the waters more, maybe.
If
But
you think of it that way, yes.
Policy, right? Not for allow. Only apply for the most simple default deny policy. Sorry, go ahead, Costin.
So it's an Istio-D. It's an Istio-D setting, not a necessary policy. It's Istio-D behaves this way. I mean, it's a set like what mesh config is kind of doing. You are configuring the control plane to do something. You're not configuring the gateway or anything else. Anyway, Louis, you are.
Sorry, I was slightly distracted earlier in the conversation. Ian, in the example that the user faced, did they have a workload selector, or was the default deny policy namespace scoped?
I'd have to look it up. I don't remember the exact. I think in this case, I might have been the user that brought it up. So, okay. It was kind of both. If I put a system administrator hat on, I think I probably want a global one. But then if I put a user hat on, I might want to modify that behavior on like a per application basis or something.
Okay. Because L4 deny policy should apply to traffic to the waypoint as well.
No.
So we got this, like, I guess, weird distinction. By L4, you mean a policy that doesn't have any L7 attributes to it, but is not like
I mean,
like
a
you could
policy
target an
that is-
L4 policy at a
policy,
waypoint.
a policy that selects all workloads,
Would
which
not
would
apply
include
to
the
a
waypoint.
That
Yeah.
doesn't. Yeah.
Today
Yeah.
it doesn't. Sorry.
Why is that happening? And
Because
I
That's a good question.
and I fully acknowledge this is a tortuous subject, but I would have thought you would have a default deny with an allow to waypoint at L4, i.e. workload attached, where the waypoint workload was selected. That would keep you in a default deny posture.
Kind of. Because it would still mean like you get default deny until you have a waypoint that you say this waypoint can be used for something, and now it is allowed to work for everything.
Well, so which side of the transaction are you trying to protect, Andrew? Right? Are you trying to say what actions can be performed, or who is allowed to call?
So I'm thinking of it as if someone deploys some new application, I would want them to explicitly have to say, these are the things that could talk to me.
So these are the identities. So who can call?
Yeah, or it's only this path that's open and it's open to everyone, or whatever it is. But
well, that's separate, right? Because that's the other side, right? That's the operation they're allowed to perform, right? Which an L4 only policy can't say.
Yeah, I guess if
Right,
I'm
so
equating it to sidecar, I think if I remember correctly with sidecar, you could essentially just say like nothing's allowed to talk to here, and then until I open an authorization policy to allow it.
Right. So now in this world with ambient, you have two things you have to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's allowed to talk to what at L4, and that includes the waypoint.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a policy whose default deny all identities except this identity is allowed to talk to the waypoint. And then at the waypoint, you have to have a separate policy that says that identity is allowed to talk to these operations.
So I guess the trouble that we hit here right now is that there is no default way of saying any new waypoint is closed until we've allowed hope the specific call through it.
Right. So that's why I was asking why is if a namespace scoped workload attached policy is in default deny, it should apply to the waypoint.
Yeah.
It means nothing can talk to the waypoint, and therefore the waypoint can't do anything. That was right. That was the reason why I was asking John. John was like, I'm not sure.
I guess
that was
so. Oh, sorry. I think it would in a sandwich scenario, but I don't think that the waypoint itself interprets that as nothing can talk to me.
Okay.
And
right. So
don't
we're not
forget-
inheriting.
I totally misunderstood your point there the first time through. Sorry. I otherwise would have tried to address more directly.
Okay.
And
So
don't forget-
this is
Oh,
a
sorry.
fundamental issue, right? Because if we do use sandwiching, we would have inherited that behavior from ztunnel.
Yes.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so now we have this impedance mismatch between the potential implementation detail, which is not a great place to be. And Waypoint should probably do that.
Can you clarify what happens today, though? Like, I was a bit confused when you started talking
So
about.
for any other workloads type except Waypoint today, if I have a policy that says deny all, right?
Yeah.
Everything gets denied. I now create another, because Waypoint is just a workload, right? It's just a workload with some enhanced semantics, but it's still a workload. But right now, that property is not applying to that workload type.
Yeah, but why?
It is just a workload, but it's a special non-captured workload at the same time.
Well, that's an implementation,
That's an implementation detail, but yeah.
Right, like that's where we're causing ourselves a headache.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it were to do it, so now you have default deny, right? Namespace scoped or system-wide scoped. Now we have to think about the consequences or the types of API transitions people would experience if that was turned on. Right, that's the important thing to then work through. Right, so now I have default deny on at L4, I create a waypoint. It's also now in default deny state at L4, so nothing can talk to it. I then have to go and create an allow to waypoint at L4 and say allow to waypoint only. And then I also have to go attach a policy to the waypoint that says allow these operations and or these permutations of waypoint operations and personas.
But in reverse order, right? First, you need to attach the L7 policy to the waypoint, then open up L4 to the waypoint.
I don't think the order is so important, right? Because you're already in default deny. So the only reason you would have an ordering problem, Mitch, is if you were not in default, if you were in default deny but had some specific allows.
I guess what I'm thinking is if you open up an allow at L4 to the waypoint, and the waypoint doesn't have any L7 policy attached,
yeah,
it's
but
in
it's
L7
only
allow all mode. It's not in a default deny mode.
But you don't have
Right,
any
but you were-
routes. But you don't have any routes, so it's not going to go to
you
your-
already had that problem, Mitch, right? Because you were just previously, the only other allow mode you could have been in was allow at L4. Right?
No, but I guess,
So that
but I
would be-
guess what Mitch's trying to say is like first you deploy the L7, and then the moment you deploy the L4, then you're restricted with both because you don't want to have this small blip where all L7 is allowed until you deploy the additional L7 restriction.
Yeah.
No, but you're already in a world where all L7 is allowed because you had no waypoint before. By definition.
But L4 was blocked, so it didn't matter.
Well, no, so
Basically, but it's-
no. So then that doesn't create, if either in your deny everything, right? Or deny everything except, let's say, one persona or one identity. That identity was allowed at L4. You now enable waypoints. That identity is still allowed, and it's allowed for everything at L7, which is okay because it was previously allowed for everything at L4. So that's safe. Then you can go and add an L7 policy to restrict what it was able to do, right? To refine it. We didn't break.
I think we need to be careful about saying L4 and L7 versus waypoint applied and Z-tunnel applied, because as soon as a waypoint is in the middle of things, the Z-tunnel applied rules of the destination don't matter anymore, because we've already said, like, if it passes through a waypoint, the destination sees it only as L4 from the waypoint. So it's now the waypoint is enforcing all rules, not just the L7 rules. So, and this becomes a problem where if, say, you have an L4 blocking any traffic into the waypoint is perfectly secure, I agree. But as soon as you say people are allowed to talk to the waypoint, unless it has additional rules about its destinations, it's now permissive. And there's no way of telling that waypoint to be default deny of all of its destinations that it serves.
I think that what Louis indicated earlier with Ian is if the waypoint is captured by Z-tunnel, then the Z-tunnel could potentially enforce any layer 4 policy before you even get to the waypoint. So
you're saying like about the destination, like the
Yeah.
eventual destination?
You could say something like client X, instead of being able to talk to service Y, can talk to waypoint Y. And then you're still in the situation where only client X is allowed to do that.
Right, which is an L4
Hypothetically,
policy.
the waypoint would let anything else through, but nothing else reaches it because you have that posture transferred to your waypoint.
But client X can get to anything downstream of waypoint.
Right, but you already, if you had allowed client X at L4, it already had that property.
And what if you hadn't?
Yeah.
Right, so that's if you hadn't, right, then you were already in default deny for client X because you would have had to have a rule saying client X could talk to something. You don't have that rule, right? So you don't have a regression in traffic. Now, right, usually this is a process of down scoping access, right? So if you were deny all, right, not just default deny, but deny all, you have no regression. What's problematic is if you have to be very careful if you're deny by default, but allow, let's say, an identity. That's the most tricky transition to go through in terms of maintaining posture.
I would suggest,
You know what I'm saying?
Louis, I would suggest to ignore waypoints for now, because this is a problem for ingress gateways and other implementation of gateway API, especially if we are talking about gateway API semantics. And I don't think it's so bad as it sounds, because you have an L4 policies that applies to L4, and which is very clear. And normally you set network policy or whatever policy to deny access to everyone except the waypoints, gateways, and all the other entities that are allowed to communicate from Kubernetes, from outside Kubernetes, external load balancers.
I think everybody understands that we're going to specifically allow waypoint to workload within the namespace, right? And that,
Waypoint gateways, other gateways that are not Istio gateways, and other things. I mean, those need to be taken into account. I mean, it's not like a user will magically.
yeah, no, I'm just whether it's explicit or implicit,
Uh,
right? I think that like what I've heard most people say is that's implied.
Implied for Istio, we can make it implied for waypoints. We may be able to make it implied for Istio gateways, but we cannot make it implied for.
No, and agreed, right? Like for at least some cases, it has to be explicit, right? So like your L4 policy is default deny, allow from waypoint.
And
That's the
next,
only.
next level is one of the main differences between Istio APIs and gateway APIs, that L4 and L7 are treated as different entities. I mean, you have routes, you have completely different authentication models, JOTs. So it's very useful to actually keep them separated and not treat them as.
Yeah, no, the separation is useful. I think we're just like, there's the specific case that Andrew ran into, right? And we're trying to decide whether there was a regression in security. Right, or what possible structure of the API and interpretation of it would or would not yield a regression in security posture.
Yeah, I agree.
Either temporary or otherwise.
There is a strange, like, I guess, combinatorics type problem here. If you have client X and it talks to service X, you have client Y, it talks to service Y, and those are authorized, but X and Y can't crosstalk. Once you introduce a waypoint for both X and Y, because of the loss of identity, the waypoint is now the only place where you can enforce that crosstalk problem. By default, you're going to allow suddenly X can talk to Y as soon as you enter into this, whereas previously you could easily express that it cannot.
Waypoint could actually enforce for service. It cannot enforce for workload.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not expressible at waypoint, to be clear. I'm just saying that by default, you would have entered into this place where that crosstalk is not something that's.
Yes, without making those rules explicit in the L7 rules you attach to the waypoint, right? There's no inheritance of that property, right, from the L4 policy rule.
But
that's correct.
And that's where the ordering would matter, right?
Yes, but in that situation, right, where there are allows, the ordering does matter.
Yeah, but I think Nikitu had their end up for a while.
Nikitu, are you speaking? We can't hear you if you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. A little bit unclear at my end. Anyways, sorry, I kind of lost track of my question. But Luis, just a quick question regarding your last comment. So, what would be the difference between a service and a workload?
A service has or at least in the Kubernetes sense, has a well-known VIP that is implemented by the waypoint. And so we can identify that you're talking to it, right? Okay. Because of how we implemented it. And so therefore we could, in theory, implement the L4 policy that was service attached on a service. The problem we can't do it for workloads is because workloads can belong to many services. Right, and it makes the combinatorics crazy.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, so far, at least on our end, we have been interpreting service and workload as one and the same thing. So I mean, each workload or a microservice is represented by a service object, right? So that's how we kind of correlate the two.
Yeah, like in the majority of cases, that is true, but not in all cases. Right, and there are enough not all cases that we have to deal with this.
Yeah, ambient firm makes distinctions about that too when it's handling traffic.
And gateway API
Yeah,
and
so-
everyone else. I mean, it's never a good idea to treat service and workload as the same thing. I mean, that's the root of all evil in Istio and Kubernetes.
Yeah, we don't have microservices. We have micro workloads, but
Even if we had, I mean, mixing L4 and L7, people who skip that lesson in school are paying the price.
Right. Yeah. So that particular aspect creates a very overwhelming experience for developers who are not intimately familiar with service mesh or Kubernetes, for that example. Right. So for people who are in the business of building a IDP, that creates a huge challenge of how to simplify the basic aspect of running their applications without intimate knowledge of ambient mesh or service mesh in general. Just think out loud.
Or the opposite, most people outside mesh and Kubernetes don't have any problem because that's how the world works. The only people who have problems with confusion are people who are used with Istio model where we mix L4 and L7. But if you most of the world, they have a load balancer gateway where they apply policies, and then they enforce somehow that this is the entry point that's enforced. You cannot get directly to workloads. So
yeah,
there is
I
no
mean,
side.
other than transitionary cases, if all your workloads are really just services, and the only way you ever talk to them is by proxies, Waypoint actually works really well as a mental model because it's the same as Ingress. It's because the L4 things were allowed, right? And how you transition to this pure L7 world, right? That you can stumble into fail open by default or fail close by default and kill yourself, right? If you say, look, the only thing that's allowed to talk to things inside the namespace is the waypoint, and all the policies in the waypoint are directly enforced just like they would be at Ingress, right? Then you have a very natural model that everybody's familiar with. It's the transitions that are hard, right? Where I don't have a waypoint yet. So that's why we generally recommend that if you're going to use waypoints all the time, and you want L7 properties, then just have a waypoint for everything all the time. It's just much easier to reason about.
Yeah.
And then you opt some things out and say they're L4 only because you need that for performance, right? Which is probably a small number of things like databases or caches, right? Very high throughput systems. Or put it another way, if it's a database or a cache, don't put it in behind a waypoint. Everything else, put it behind a waypoint because it's probably HTTP. But we sought to deal with Andrew's problem, right?
Can you say that one more time?
If your services are synonymous with your workload, so they're the same thing, and their traffic is HTTP, they should always go behind a waypoint.
Okay.
Because you're going to want L7 policies against them. Right? It's the easiest mental model. Right? Just like I put them all behind Ingress once upon a time.
Right.
And then there's a few exceptions to that rule, usually for performance. Right? Databases, caches, queues, very high throughput systems that need to be at L4 only. And so you just exclude those. But there are not that many of them. Right? So you're in a waypoint by default stance, right? When you roll out.
Got it.
Now, what's tricky is the transition, right? And Andrew's example is a transition problem, right? I was at L4, I had policies, now I want to go to L7. How do we do that safely? And there are things to fix or document better at the very least, right? To make it so it's clear to people how they should go about doing that safely.
Great. Thank you so much.
So to try to, if I can maybe summarize and check if I'm understanding correctly, the waypoint, adding a waypoint and not making any changes to policy should not make any change to what traffic is allowed. The simple existence of a waypoint does not fundamentally change what is allowed or disallowed. Is that correct?
I
would say
it may, in practice. If X was allowed to talk to Y and you introduce a waypoint, X is still allowed to talk to Y, but everything goes through the waypoint. Waypoint's not allowed to talk to Y, you've had a change. You've experienced a change, whether you meant to or not.
Right. I think that's right, Mitch. Right. Waypoint is an explicit delegation model. It's not implicit. Right. And we have to be a composable system.
Right.
Right. So we don't inherit identity or do those types of things. Waypoints don't pretend to be other identities. Otherwise we couldn't compose. Right, safely. So it is a change to introduce a waypoint.
But if you apply Mitch's scenario to a default deny scenario, you wouldn't expect having waypoint added to change your default deny posture, right?
And it wouldn't.
Well, what you said is I wanted a waypoint in the network path. It's not like I just stood up a gateway and didn't send traffic through. I did two things, right? That's the change. It's not like running a gateway doesn't do anything. It's saying I want to go through it that does something, right? Use a waypoint.
Right, assuming you added a waypoint and also declare use the waypoint, I'd expect the default deny continue to function until somebody actually made the rule to explicitly allow.
Right, so the default deny, like let's assume for the moment that the waypoint actually implemented the L4 default deny, which, as John mentioned, he wasn't sure, and
Yep.
I'm not sure either. Right, so let's assume that happened.
Yep.
Then you'd stay in default deny.
Yep.
So I'm sure it does not implement it. What I
Yes,
want
no,
to be confident is why.
Right, yes. Why is it? Let's just hypothetically, let's assume that it does. Then default deny would continue to work.
It's only sort of, though, because as soon as you say, X is allowed to talk to the waypoint, you're now saying X is allowed to talk to the waypoint and through the waypoint to any destination that the waypoint serves. So I could have had default deny on all of those destinations. And by saying waypoint is allowed to have people talk to it, you've turned off all the default denies, not just like one that you wanted.
Well, so what you're saying is I've taken what was a rule that said X can talk to Y, and I've split it X to waypoint and waypoint to Y.
Yeah,
that's true, right? But it's the default, like just trying to be precise, the default deny remained in place. It's when I made an allow, now I have a challenge, right? So I said waypoint is allowed to talk to everything, right?
Yeah.
Sorry,
and
like,
now it's changed the dynamic.
Sorry, Andrew, can you clarify? So you're saying like, is that correct? That like the moment I have a default deny, and the moment I deploy a waypoint and allow client X to talk to the waypoint, it does not imply that the waypoint can talk to anything, right?
Well, so
that is
there's
correct.
client to the endpoint,
Kinda.
endpoint to the server.
So let's say we have something where you've got like client X and then target Y and Z, and you want both target Y and Z now to be served by this waypoint. You would, for the waypoint to be able to function that way, need to create a waypoint is allowed to talk to Y and a waypoint is allowed to talk to Z. And if you just did that and then lived in the world that Lewis is talking about, where waypoint on its would still deny incoming traffic, we'd still be in a deny everything, and that's fine. But as soon as you then let anybody talk to waypoint, there is nothing by default that's saying, client X, who was originally only allowed to talk to Y, is now still restricted to only talk to Y. Because if the waypoint is allowed to talk to Y and Z, and the waypoint has no additional authorization policies controlling who can go through it to talk to Y and Z, now client X can talk to both Y and Z, even though maybe you have restrictions ahead of time that said that X is only allowed to talk to one of those.
Yeah, when you add those policies, you would want to make sure you don't say, X can talk to waypoint, but instead say X can talk to service Y, which is implemented by the waypoint, because the waypoint actually knows the destination service and can enforce a policy fine-grained like that.
Yeah. So then if you're transitioning from the world where it did not have a waypoint, you need to make sure you've replicated these authorization policies and bound them to those services.
Yeah,
I think that's
and it would
where
actually be
people are going
like,
to get caught.
Yeah, like let's say hypothetically we decided we were like, oh, we're going to automate that. Well, before they were workload oriented and now they're service oriented. So providing tooling to help you do that, feasible. Doing it at runtime, probably not.
That's fair. It doesn't sound complicated. It's just I would guess, I'm not the last person to have fallen into this trap.
John, just on the converse to my earlier question about why Waypoint is not implementing the L4 workload attached policy to Waypoint, is ZTOL implementing service attached policies at L4? It should be, right?
I don't think zTunnel understands target ref attached things, but I might be wrong about that.
Only the workload selector, right?
Yes, it's only workload selector.
Or none, which is effectively workload selector all.
Right. So you could do
Yes.
it at namespace level. Yeah.
Right. So here's and here's where the earlier question kind of resonates with this stuff about and the attachment points matter a lot. If the allow policy was attached to a service at L4, right? Waypoint could actually implement that. If the allow policy is attached to a workload, it cannot or can't reasonably directly enforce it. Because in what people were doing at sidecars and migrating, they have no policies attached to services right now. Now you could say, tell people at L4 you can attach policies to service, and zTunnel could actually implement it. The problem with that is if you directly talk to a pod and not talk to the service VIP, we don't know what you're talking to, and so you get this inconsistent behavior. If I talk to the service, I get deny. If I talk to the pod, I don't. Right? So we tried to avoid that. Right? I believe that's the reason why we didn't do it. But it then creates this headache for waypoints, right? Which do implement it. So either way, people have to go through a policy transition of some form to get the behavior that they want. And the question is, what's the safest path? I don't think we can change the fundamental property of the system modulo the should Waypoint actually implement its own L4 stuff. And it probably should.
What if we were to separate these to different APIs and, in theory, maybe put something in Gateway that will deal with the L4 part?
Well, so as a
We
good
discussed that.
thought exercise, yeah. Like, imagine zTunnel implemented the network policy API instead, or ambient implemented network policy, or you just had a CNI implementing network policy and the CNI magically supported waypoints, right? Same problem, exactly the same problem here.
I mean, it's the same problem, but would it be less confusing for the users that right now it's not the same API that targets the way like the L7 part and targets the L4 part? So in a way, we're becoming a little bit more composable, and the user experience is a little bit clearer.
Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, so we discussed this. I remember this was one of the discussions before we took ambient to beta, whether or not we were going to use a different API or not. I don't know that a different API is going to affect the composability of the system, but it does heavily influence the user experience of the system, to your later point, Lior, right? If I have a policy under one group, the Istio automation policy security group, and then I add a waypoint, it doesn't make sense to me that I have to go and create another policy of that same group, because I see it as being a part of the same system. However, when you make explicit the lines of the composability, then it's a clue to the user. It's like, okay, I may have a network policy here, but now I deploy this layer 7 thing. I might need to go and write an authorization policy at L7 to do something different. And I think that's what's missing in the user journey here. Aside from that, I think that this is all very good feedback, because the pattern of an in-cluster gateway is something that Kubernetes has been wanting to do. And in some way try to replace service with that was, at least at one point in time, the direction or the hope of some people. I think this happens regardless. these issues are going to happen for any in-cluster gateway implementation. When you have a gateway inside of it, like anything that talks to that gateway, you have to be careful of what policies are applied to the gateway versus what's applied outside the gateway. And we can talk about how to make the UX prettier, but I think that's the fundamental problem. When you add a new node into a distributed system that is doing networking, it needs its own set of policies. And I think the issue with ambient right now is just that that's not immediately clear that there's a shift that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, as Keith mentioned, right, we actually discussed this at significant length. We really do have two APIs, right? If you use workload selector, right, you can only have L4 properties. If you use target ref, you can have L7 properties. Like they really are two APIs, right, crammed into the same scheme.
Yeah.
And that obviously is creating the assumption that we do some magic to make this easier, right? Whereas, like, if you took two orthogonal systems, an L4 system and an L7 system, let's say a CNI and another gateway, you'd still have exactly these problems, right, to resolve.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be tooling to convert the L4 properties of one into the L7 properties of another, because nobody bothered to write it because they were two different systems.
No, right. Yeah. I mean, the problems would still be there. I guess I have two things. Like, one is like, it would be easier, obviously, if, let's say, like the in-cluster gateway implementation, or like, say, for example, Istio would be the one to implement the two different policies, like, L4 and L7. And B, where I'm coming from is like, I'm trying to think, hey, how can, because, this kind of like a lot of questions about authorization, about confusion, like also network policy, but also identities and authorizations are kind of coming up again and again in different forms, different meetings. And I'm trying to think if we could somehow improve it, whether it's like having this, this API and gateway that would also supports, for example, a service if we wanted to, or like, kind of do something really similar to the authorization policy version that currently already supported. But definitely, I guess we could do a lot on the user experience side. I'm not suggesting we may automate and eliminate the implication of like, hey, we have two attachment points. I mean, that's clear.
I mean, like John's suggestion earlier, which is like, we can actually go create a tool, right? That, like, there are three use cases, right? You have waypoints, you have sidecars, you don't have, or you just have Z-tunnel at L4. And you could tell us what transition you're trying to make, and then we could make a best effort to infer what the new policy should be for that transition point. Right, so for example, you had, let's say you did workload attached policies, Z-tunnel, L4, ambient, and you plan to introduce a waypoint, Andrew's case. You had default deny, but you allowed X to talk to Y. We could absolutely generate, and Y was a service, right? Y was not a workload. Or we could figure out that the Y workloads were strictly synonymous with Y the service and were exclusively used for it, right? So we could infer that it was a service, right? Even though it was workload attached. Then we could generate a waypoint rule that would say, oh, X can talk to service Y at L7, or to be implemented by the waypoint. We could produce that policy. There's obviously edge cases, right? If a workload is a member of multiple services, right, then maybe you have to produce two policies or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Like it
that's where it
starts.
Yeah.
But it's inherently complicated because somebody did something complicated, right? Neku's example earlier, where his workloads were synonymous with services, there was only one service and workloads only ever belonged to one service, is relatively straightforward.
Yeah.
I don't think we want to do that at runtime, which is why we didn't do it. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in this document I wrote about a year ago about these permutations, but we could write that tool. That's something we definitely could take on, I think, as a project that would help people. Sidecar is more complicated, but I still think we could probably produce something that would help people with sidecars too.
I wonder if we can somehow optimize for the majority of the cases, which is pod to service communication, and make things simplify, and then have the pod to pod, or like workload to workload, an extension that could be more confusing. We could optimize that with tooling, but I'm trying to think if theoretically, if we just take all pot to pot and we say, hey, pot to service is something that 80% of the users probably going to use. If there is any optimization we could do there.
Without automated on top of the existing API service, or are you talking about tooling?
Yeah, automate, like not tooling.
More challenging, I think. But we can certainly talk about it. Okay.
Can you reference this document you'd
Oh
written?
yeah, let me go dig those up. There's 3 of them. I guess there's another action item here, which is, should Waypoint implement the L4 policy, which we haven't established. That's just a more direct technical question and assessment of whether it would break anybody if it did. Yeah. You go dig up the doc, by the way.
I was just going to try and, I mean, there's been a lot of really good nuanced discussion here. I think in some ways we've missed the core conceit of this, which is that you get this change in posture when you introduce a waypoint. And we still didn't really get around to how do you express that any waypoint which is entered into the system is default deny. That, I think, remains unresolved. I mean, there's been a lot of good discussions that are in the same ballpark, but I think we've sort of gotten away from that.
Well, that if Waypoint implemented the L4 policy, it would inherit the L4 property of default deny if that was in place.
I think the delta there, though, is as soon as you've opened up L4 to the waypoint, there is no default way of saying that waypoint should have also then not let other things through it to specific destinations. Like, you can't do a authorization policy that targets all services as allow nothing, like as a default deny. So if you make that waypoint, there's no defaults that waypoint can apply.
Can you not target the waypoint directly with L7 policy?
You can, but you have
So
to
you'd have to-
explicitly do that. You
Yeah,
don't
it's
get
like I create a
free
waypoint
default.
and I need to also do the apply. Like, you don't get it for free. Exactly.
Yeah, you still have things to do.
That's
Like,
the central conceit, is you've moved from I get default deny for free to I need to explicitly make my deny policy and bind it to this waypoint.
Yeah.
And that's incongruent, I think.
Does that exist today with
Also,
gateways?
just time check, where
Oh yeah,
if
time check.
people, I don't know if we want to defer this or circle back, people can think on it. If people can go over and want to stay on and talk, I'm cool with that as well.
Yeah, it would be nice to think a little bit and maybe resurface this next week, because I think we all need some time to think through too. It's a very complex topic for sure.
Yeah, in fairness, I don't think it's going to land in 125, so it is not the most critical thing. I'm okay to defer. till next
But
week.
if we do in fact have scheduling a waypoint creates a hole in our L4 policy because waypoint is not currently enforcing L4, we probably ought to have a security bulletin about that.
Well, it's not a bug or anything. It's intended. It maybe isn't how Louis thought it was implemented, but it doesn't mean it's not documented as such, explicitly tested that way, written that way. Like, that's, I mean, we can talk about tweaking it for sure, but I don't think we need a security bulletin because someone who admittedly is Louis, so didn't understand that what we chose to do, right? It's more of just we should continue to improve our documentation and understanding of things to make it more clear, I think.
Yeah, I would recommend people read through the RFC on the authorization policy status. There are some links to some prior iterations of docs which discuss some of the issues that were raised here. in the comments and other places, probably, and I'll just link it in the chat because but it's also this doc, and I'll make sure it's in the agenda too. Right, so I would recommend people read those two docs. Andrew, because you have a concrete use case, like I can hypothesize it, but it would actually be nice to see it, explicit details of it. So if you could share those in Slack maybe or somewhere, that would be nice.
Yeah, I can. I'm admittedly trying to dream up concrete use cases rather than have one specific, but I could make a simplified, concrete looking example.
Well, have a look at the docs, because maybe what you are thinking of is in there already.
Yeah, agreed.
And then just put a comment on it.
Yeah.
And I will definitely give it some thought this week for sure. As to the attachment part, I'm in John's camp. I hate params ref. Throw my OR for target ref equals gateway class, and the gateway spec can say recommend things to do, but they can't prevent you from doing things like this. So if we think it's a bad idea, we shouldn't do it.
Yeah, my takeaway is that both of the considered things so far, we should probably just not do that, and we should look for some other thing, TBD. So in that sense,
mesh config is a good start.
Yeah, mesh config waypoint deny by default equals true false. Although I hate booleans, love enums.
And with a per namespace like we have in other parts of mesh config, is not to make Lean happy. So.
And then we'll take up offline in Slack why waypoint is not implementing the L4 thing. I'm sure there's.
And why it's a feature, not a bug.
Well, it's a bug and it's a feature until we say it's a bug. Okay.
Sounds good. Good summary. All right, should we wrap this call up? Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Andrew, for the user case. That's very interesting. Thank you, Ian, for bringing this up. Let's resume next week. Thanks,
Thanks, folks. Cheers.
Thank you.